If you have ever watched a freight train pass, you have probably waited for it. The last car. That final moment when the crossing gate lifts and traffic can move again. But before the gates go up, there is one more thing rolling past. Something small enough to miss if you are not looking. A metal box, clamped to the rear coupler of the last freight car, with a red light pulsing steadily into the distance. That box has a name. Several names, actually, depending on who you ask. The railroads call it an end-of-train device. The Federal Railroad Administration calls it an ETD. But the people who actually work on freight trains gave it a different name entirely. They called it FRED. And FRED was not a term of affection. It stood for Flashing Rear End Device. Though the railroad crews who watched it replace their coworkers added a word in front that made the acronym a little more colorful. However, what sounds like a simple piece of safety equipment has a story behind it that stretches back over 150 years. So how did a 35-pound metal box replace an entire railroad car, eliminate thousands of jobs, and nearly get people killed in the process? It was 1869 in Pittsburgh, and a 22-year-old inventor named George Westinghouse had just built something that the railroad industry thought was impossible. A braking system powered by compressed air, controlled from the locomotive cab alone. At the time, stopping a freight train was one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. Brakemen rode on top of moving freight cars, in rain and snow and darkness, turning heavy iron handwheels to engage the brakes on each car individually. The engineer would blow the whistle, and the brakemen would start running across the rooftops, cranking down the brakes one car at a time. Thousands of brakemen died doing this work, and thousands more lost fingers, hands, and limbs. They carried no safety lines. Their footing was a narrow catwalk on top of a swaying boxcar, and the only warning of a low bridge or tunnel ahead was a set of dangling ropes called a telltale, strung high above the track. If you felt the ropes brush your body, you had seconds to drop flat or risk being swept off the car. It was so dangerous that life insurance companies refused to cover brakemen at standard rates. Before Westinghouse's invention, trains could take nearly 2 miles to come to a full stop. And because no single brakeman could reach every car in time, trains were limited to about 10 cars in length. Longer trains simply could not be stopped safely. Westinghouse changed all of that. His compressed air system reduced stopping distance from thousands of yards to hundreds, and it allowed a single engineer to control the brakes on every car from the locomotive cab. The Railroad Safety Appliance Act of 1893 made air brakes mandatory on every train in the United States. But the air brake did not eliminate the caboose. It eliminated the most terrifying part of the brakeman's job. What remained was still essential. The crew riding in the caboose served as the train's rear-end eyes. From the raised cupola on top, the conductor and flagman watched for problems that the engineer up front could never see. Shifted loads, dragging equipment, and the most feared hazard of all, a hot box, an overheated journal bearing that could seize, fracture, and send a freight car tumbling off the rails at speed. The caboose was a rolling office, a kitchen, a bunkhouse, and an observation post all packed into a single car. The conductor processed waybills and schedules on a fold-down desk. On overnight runs across empty prairie, crew members slept in narrow bunks and cooked meals on a cast-iron stove bolted to the floor. Hobos who rode the rails knew the caboose as the doghouse. Railroaders called it the hack, the crummy, or simply the cabin. Many railroads assigned cabooses to individual conductors the way a trucking company assigns a rig to a driver. Crews hung curtains, stocked coffee and canned goods, and sometimes kept personal tools or books on board for runs that could last days. The word caboose itself likely came from the Dutch kombuis, a term for a ship's galley, which tells you something about what the car really was. It was home. For over a century, the red caboose at the end of the train was as familiar as the steam locomotive pulling the front. Like the red barn and the one-room schoolhouse, it became an American symbol. So what happened to it? The answer begins in Florida, in 1963, with one of the longest and most violent labor disputes of the 20th century. The Florida East Coast Railway, a 350-mile line running between Jacksonville and Miami, was controlled by a man named Edward Ball, who managed the Alfred DuPont estate. Ball believed the railroad could not survive paying the same labor costs as the larger Class I carriers. When he tried to cut costs, the operating unions went on strike in January of that year. What followed was 14 years of chaos, one of the longest and most bitter labor conflicts in 20th century America. Strikers bombed freight trains and sabotaged tracks along the main line. Replacement workers were shot at on the job. Several trains were derailed by deliberate acts of vandalism. Federal authorities eventually intervened to stop the violence, and the United States Supreme Court upheld the railroad's right to continue operating with replacement workers throughout the dispute. During those years, while other railroads watched from a distance, Ball poured money into automation and physical improvements. He rebuilt track, installed concrete ties, and pushed the FEC toward a model that the rest of the industry would not match for decades. The Florida East Coast became the first American railroad to run with just two-man crews, the first to end all unprofitable passenger service by 1968. And in 1969, the first to replace the caboose with a small electronic box bolted to the rear coupler of the last freight car. That box was the original Fred, and by today's standards, it was almost laughably crude. A battery, a connection to the brake line, and a flashing red light. No data transmission, no remote commands, no telemetry of any kind. The device simply blinked in the dark, telling any following train that something was ahead on the track. But the railroads saw something in that blinking light that the unions feared. They saw a future without cabooses, without rear-end crews, and without the enormous expense of maintaining, switching, and staffing a dedicated car on every freight train in the country. The fight that followed lasted almost 20 years. Railroad unions, particularly the United Transportation Union and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, campaigned state by state to preserve full crew laws that effectively mandated cabooses by requiring multiple crew members on every freight train. Their argument was simple, and on its face, reasonable. A trained human being sitting in a caboose cupola could see things no electronic device could detect. Someone up in that glass dome could smell burning grease from a failing bearing, spot a shifted load that had not yet triggered a mechanical fault, or flag down a following train in an emergency. And for a while, they had a point. But the economics were brutal. In 1980, operating a caboose cost 92 cents per mile. For a train covering 1,000 miles, that added nearly $1,000 in caboose costs alone, before counting crew wages. Terminal switching added more. Every departure and arrival required extra moves to attach or detach the caboose. One superintendent on the Cotton Belt Railroad estimated his terminal spent $300 a day just on caboose handling, and the caboose itself was expensive to build and maintain. In 1985, Robert Claytor, chairman of Norfolk Southern, put the comparison in stark terms. A caboose cost about $80,000, weighed 25 tons, and required track space, switching crews, and constant upkeep. Its replacement cost about $4,000, weighed 35 pounds, and needed nothing but a battery. How do you argue against numbers like that? If you are finding this useful, consider subscribing. We cover railroad history and engineering like this every week. The Staggers Rail Act of 1980 had already begun loosening federal regulation of the railroad industry, giving carriers more flexibility in crew sizes and equipment choices. Then came the 1982 National Agreement between the major railroads and the United Transportation Union, which initially allowed cabooses to be removed from 25% of trains. The Federal Railroad Administration began granting waivers based on data from pilot programs showing that the electronic devices provided monitoring capabilities that matched or exceeded what a human crew could do from the caboose cupola. By the mid-1980s, cabooses were disappearing from mainline freight trains across the country. Trains that once carried an engineer, a conductor, and one or two brakemen shifted to two-person crews riding entirely in the locomotive cab. By 1990, the transition was essentially complete. The red caboose, a fixture of American railroading for more than a century, was gone from revenue service on every major railroad. Thousands of cabooses were scrapped, sold, or donated. Some survived as maintenance-of-way crew shelters or shoving platforms for yard switching. Others ended up in city parks, at railroad museums, or converted into roadside diners and novelty gift shops. But the era of a crude car at the end of every freight train was over. What replaced it evolved quickly. Early models, called dumb units, were nothing more than darkness-activated flashing lights, markers that saved battery power by switching on only after sunset. A second generation added a brake pipe pressure gauge, earning the label Average Intelligence. These could tell the crew something, but not much, and only if someone walked back to check the gauge. The real leap came with smart units that included radio transmitters. These sent brake line pressure data forward to a receiver mounted in the locomotive cab, a device the crews nicknamed Wilma. Every 40 seconds, the ETD transmitted its readings. If something changed suddenly, a drop in brake pressure or unexpected train movement, it sent an alert immediately. The signal traveled on an assigned frequency, covering 3 to 5 miles under good conditions. But in the rush to cut costs and modernize, had the railroads overlooked something? The old caboose had carried something besides crew members. It carried an emergency brake valve. If the train's airline froze, or if a blockage prevented the engineer's brake command from reaching the rear cars, the crew in the caboose could pull that valve and dump the air from behind. It was a simple, mechanical backup for a situation where the primary braking system failed from the front. When the caboose vanished, so did that valve. And the early Fred units could send data forward, but they could not receive commands back. They were one-way devices. So when ice blocked the brake line on trains running through mountain territory, the engineer's emergency brake application only reached the cars forward of the blockage. Every car behind the blockage kept rolling, pushing the front half forward with no way to stop. The result was runaway trains, and those runaways killed people. The Federal Railroad Administration acted. Fred was redesigned into a two-way telemetry system. The engineer now had a button on the locomotive console that sent a radio signal to the rear unit. When triggered, a valve on the end of the train device opened within 1 second, venting the brake line from behind and applying emergency braking to the entire train from both ends simultaneously. This two-way capability became mandatory. It was folded into the required air brake testing procedures, part of the initial terminal test that every train must pass before leaving the yard. A modern end-of-train device is a compact, weatherproof unit that does the work of an entire caboose crew. Brake line pressure is monitored continuously. A motion sensor detects accidental separation of the train and alerts the crew instantly if cars come uncoupled. GPS capability tracks the train's rear position in real time. Some newer models carry small turbine generators powered by air pressure from the brake line itself, eliminating the constant need for battery replacements that plagued earlier versions. The flashing red marker light uses ambient light sensors to activate only when conditions require it, and reflective material on the housing catches headlight beams from approaching trains even if the light fails. The device weighs under 30 pounds. It clamps onto the rear coupler and connects to the brake hose in minutes. When the train reaches its destination, a crew member unbolts the unit and carries it to the next assignment. Across the country, on every active freight train, there is one of these boxes doing its job at the back of the line. Meanwhile, the argument that a human crew could spot problems no machine could detect grew weaker with each passing year. Trackside detection systems that did not exist in the caboose era now line the rights-of-way across the country. Hot bearing detectors scan every passing axle with infrared sensors. Dragging equipment detectors catch anything hanging below the car's clearance envelope. Acoustic monitors listen for the distinct sound of a failing wheel bearing. The network of automated eyes and ears along the track now catches problems that no crew member peering from a cupola window could have reliably spotted, especially on a mile-long train moving at speed through darkness. And the debate the ETD started has never really ended. Today, Some railroads are pushing to reduce train crews from 2 people to 1, arguing that technology has advanced far enough to make a single engineer safe in the locomotive cab. Unions oppose it, using nearly identical arguments to the ones they made when the caboose disappeared. Technology versus human judgment. Cost savings versus safety margins. It is the same tension, replaying across a different generation of railroaders. The caboose still lives in model train sets and museum displays, in children's books, and the collective memory of anyone who ever stood at a crossing and watched a freight train go by. The image of a red car rocking gently at the end of a long consist, smoke curling from its stovepipe chimney, remains one of the most recognizable symbols of American railroading. It represents something that was real and functional, a workspace where people ate and slept and watched over machines that could kill them if anything went wrong. But does the blinking box that took its place carry any of that romance? It does not have a cupola or a coffee pot or curtains in the windows. Nobody writes their name inside the housing or hangs a picture near the battery compartment. It cannot wave to a child standing by the tracks. But every 40 seconds, it sends a signal forward, confirming that the last car is still connected, that the air pressure is holding, and that the train is whole. And if something goes wrong, it can stop everything from behind in less than a second. The real question is not whether Fred does its job. It does. The question is what it means when a piece of technology does a job so well that the people it replaced become a memory. And whether the next generation of railroaders will look at the crew in the locomotive cab the same way we now look at the crew in the caboose. That answer is still being written.